All right, it looks like it seems like the room is filling up, so we can go ahead and begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Emma Grover, and I am a member of the ISTF conference organizing team. I'm honored to introduce today's keynote speaker, Josefina Braña Varela. Josefina has dedicated more than 20 years to the global environmental issues, in particular forest conservation. She currently serves as the Vice President and Deputy Lead of the Forest Team at World Wildlife Fund. In this role, she manages and supports efforts dedicated to halting deforestation and forest degradation. In addition, Josefina is point on forest climate solutions for WWF. Here she oversees a multidisciplinary team working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance carbon sinks. Since 2013, she has also led WWF's global forest and climate policy agenda and advocacy efforts. Josefina collaborates with WWF field offices in key geographies such as Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Indonesia. In these regions, she designs policies and interventions to conserve and restore forests. This entails building alliances with strategic stakeholders, particularly indigenous peoples and local communities living on the front lines of deforestation. Over the course of her career, Josefina has been integrally involved in major international negotiations. From 2009 to 2013, she was part of Mexico's delegation to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Forum on Forests, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where she negotiated REDD+. For the next 45 minutes or so, Josefina will speak, after which we will have around 15 minutes to address questions from the audience. As a reminder, we will be recording this session and sharing it to our YouTube channel. We encourage you all to ask questions as they arise throughout the presentation. You can do so by typing them within the Q&A feature, and we ask that you provide your name and your affiliation as you do so. I will now go ahead and share Josefina's presentation with you all. And without further ado, welcome Josefina.
Thank you so much, Emma, and good afternoon. And thank you to the International Society of Tropical Foresters at Yale's School of the Environment for the invitation to be here with you all today. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to discuss the need for an integrated approach in landscapes that work for nature, climate, and people. And as Emma mentioned, I was involved in international negotiations and in particular in the UNFCCC space. And it's not every day that you see history unfold before you. Next slide, Emma, please. But there I was in Paris at COP21 in 2015, watching excitedly as near every country in the world signed on to the first global commitment to address climate change. And thanks to countless hours of intense negotiations, the Paris Agreement expressly recognized the role forests play in tackling climate change. At prior UN conferences on climate change, I had worked to negotiate global reductions in deforestation and forest degradation to practices that, along with unsustainable land use, contribute roughly a quarter of the world's CO2 emissions. However, in the past, we didn't have all countries with a requirement to set emissions reductions targets. So when that changed in 2015, it really marked a huge milestone in my career and also for the planet. But while strong global commitments are vital for setting long-term goals, they won't be effective unless countries have the resources and the motivation to realize them. So fast forward to today. The reality is that 6 years after the UNFCCC recognized the role of forests in tackling climate change, we are still losing the fight against deforestation and forest degradation. Next slide, please. Last year, we at WWF released a report that identifies 24 deforestation fronts. As you can see in the screen, these are places that have significant concentration of deforestation hotspots and where large areas of remaining forests are under threat. This analysis focused only in the tropics and subtropics, which accounted for at least 2/3 of global forest cover loss from 2000 to 2018, and where forest fragmentation is quite significant. Collectively, an area the size of California was lost to deforestation in just over a decade in these regions alone, in the tropics and subtropics. Now, 9 of these 24 deforestation fronts are in Latin America, a region that has experienced a dramatic decline in wildlife populations. 8 of those fronts are in Africa and 7 in the Asia Pacific region. Deforestation took place at the fastest rates in the Brazilian Amazon and the Cerrado, the Bolivian Amazon, Paraguay, Argentina, Madagascar, and Sumatra and Borneo in Indonesia and Malaysia. So, and in addition, meanwhile, as we were processing the significance of the Paris Agreement and gearing up for the implementation of actions, science continued providing more and more information and insights about another equally pressing global problem. And this is the biodiversity crisis. Next slide, Emma, please. Here, World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report published in 2020 confirmed the trends we feared. Globally, nature is declining at unprecedented rates, and human activities have caused the world's wildlife population to plummet by more than 2/3 in the last 50 years. This dramatic decline is directly related to forest loss and degradation. And in the screen, you can see 2 indexes that inform these findings and that were included in the Living Planet report. The one you see at the top is the Species Habitat Index. As human land use change and increasingly climate change are altering the landscapes worldwide, the Species Habitat Index quantifies implications for species populations. It helps us measure the losses in habitat suitable range from observed or model habitat changes. And as you can see here, between the year 2000 and 2018, this index fell by 2%, indicating a strong and general downward trend in habitat available to species. The other index shown here at the bottom is the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is compounded of a large set of ecologically diverse animal and plant species, and it's a good way to measure ecosystems' ability to provide benefits to people through ecosystem services. The proposed safe limit for this index is 90%. And as you can see in the graph, the global average is well below that at 79%. And the trend is going downwards, which is telling us that world's terrestrial biodiversity is already dangerously compromised. The way we produce and consume food and energy, and frankly, the flagrant disregard for the environment entrenching in our current economic model, have pushed the natural world to its limits. And it has a huge implication not only for the health of the planet, but for our own health as humans. Let's go to the next slide, please. Well, the reality is that humanity is facing another unprecedented emergency, a global pandemic. Human health and the health of our environments are inextricably linked. Our collective capacity for resilience as humans, well-being, nutrition, as well as our ability to avoid diseases are really entirely related to the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the ways we interact with nature. And definitely nature offers enormous benefits and various avenues to preserve human life, reduce the prevalence of diseases, and generally to promote our well-being. In the case of forests, in many contexts, they help meet basic needs. For example, by providing wild food, medicine, cooking fuel, shelter. And of course, forests also provide mental and physical benefits associated with reducing the risk of some non-communicable diseases such as diabetes or hard conditions. And forests are the first line of defense against the emergence and spread of zoonotic infectious diseases. Viruses like COVID-19, Ebola, and the flu originate from animal hosts that subsequently come into contact with people. And as you can see in this slide, there is a complex chain of drivers and circumstances that leads to a spillover, outbreak, and pandemic. The system drivers and the feedback loops that you can see on the screen have many complex interactions, but and sometimes the trends seem very unlikely, but the reality is we know all too well that outbreak does happen as we are in the middle still of this pandemic. Zoonotic infectious diseases transmissible from animals to humans are examples of how human health and the natural environment are connected. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this relationship, I just want to point out that between 1940 and 2005, land use changes such as deforestation contributed to almost half of the outbreaks of zoonotic diseases in humans worldwide. So COVID-19 is a clear manifestation of our broken relationship with nature. And yet, historically, environmental conservation and human health have been assessed and treated separately. Now, concurrently, the health of our planet is also at risk due to accelerating climate change. The more forests we lose, the more species are left homeless and unable to survive, and the more difficult it becomes to fight climate change. At the same time, the more climate changes, the more vulnerable forests are to extreme events, such as more frequent and intense fires. And the fires that devastated the Amazon, Australia, and the Arctic in 2019, and the fires we are now seeing on a yearly basis are clear examples of what is yet to come. And guess what? Our carbon footprint affecting the health of the planet is getting back at our health too. Air pollution and rising temperatures contribute to cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. And there's a growing concern about the effect of climate change on nutrition, as there's many studies now that show that increased CO2 emissions will result in crops being grown with lower levels of key vitamins and nutrients. And degradation of coral reefs will result in loss of access to food for around 500 million people. And I could keep going, but the point is that everything is connected. There are so many underlying issues affecting these complex links that they are often overlooked. So we need to drill down to understand how these forces interact and how they can be tackled by applying a systems approach appropriate to each context. Okay, so looking ahead, there is a more hopeful path. Last year, Nature published a paper on how bending the terrestrial biodiversity curve would require an integrated strategy, and how, with unprecedented ambition and coordination, scaled-up conservation and food systems transformation can definitely lead us to a future where both people and nature can thrive. But here's the trick. We need to break down silos and start promoting cross-sectoral coordination to create lasting interventions. And this will require intentionally planning and design to deliver simultaneous benefits for people, nature, and climate. And by doing so, we will deliver sustainable landscapes in which people and nature are co-beneficiaries of conservation, and where sustainable livelihoods and economic growth are part of conservation planning. All of this, of course, while respecting communities and people's rights. And the reality is that there's no one size fits all. can we go to the next slide, please? So if we want to save the forests, we need to start by understanding the landscapes where they are, and then to understand the options that are feasible given that context. The history and development of each landscape is different. The level of intactness or degradation, the patterns of land tenure or ownership across the land, the current land uses, whether they're working lands or non-working lands, and future site uses. All of this is determined by this history and development and contextual factors. And these contextual realities determine the appropriate conservation interventions for us to use in these places, such as in a place could be more appropriate to promote sustainable forest management, or in another one, investing in regenerative agriculture. So when evaluating these options, we definitely need to incorporate and listen to what the science is telling us. So we pay attention to the past of the landscapes, but we take into consideration what are the future trends for that given landscape. And it's important to listen also to what the science is telling us about the prioritization of what needs to happen. A paper published last year and at the end of last year and co-authored by members of key environmental organizations from this community, it builds a case for a hierarchy of interventions within the forest sector, where we must prioritize protection, then sustainable management, and then at the end, restoration. And I want to highlight this point as this year's conference is focused on restoration efforts. And the concept of planting trees is definitely trending at the global level and has sparked unprecedented interest from the corporate sector in particular. I feel, though, that there is a misconception among some stakeholders that we can plant our way out of the climate crisis. But the reality is that protecting forests is 30 times more effective for climate change than trying to restore it. And of course, we need to use all the tools in the toolbox, but with limited time and resources to tackle the climate and nature crisis, it is important to know how to make the best decisions. We at WWF are part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we have our, excuse me, own Africa Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative in line with Africa 100. And we are certainly advancing restoration efforts in key degraded landscapes. But we often face challenges to direct investments also for forest protection. And as a community, we need to be creative on how to harness the momentum around restoration in ways that helps us to deliver for forests. And that means to include keeping primary forests standing. I look forward for a conversation with you on any ideas on how we harness that momentum to deliver across the board. But in any case, going back to my point, context and information matter. They not only tell us what is feasible in a place, but they are usually reasons for our success or failure in the different places where we work. So if we can go over to the next slide, please, Emma. Thank you. So to ensure our efforts to improve the state and condition of a landscape's ecological function, there are social, economic, and governance factors that must also be addressed in concert with environmental change. Moving from rights and access to increased social equality to truly resilient livelihoods, and from transparency and disclosure to participatory and social accountability. As you can see in this slide, there's like different transitions. There are different social disparities and governance deficits that we need to take into consideration when we are looking at the options within the forest. To achieve a 1.5 degree future without nature loss will not only require a biophysical systems change across our energy systems, our land systems, our transport systems, and our urban systems, but also changes to the social, economic, and governance structures that underpin them. So we can't save the forest only from within. We need to understand the forces that interact at the landscape level, and we must reach out outside the sector to find solutions. Depending on where you stand, these solutions and of course the levers will be different. For example, interagency coordination, promoting integrated spatial planning, invested in improved agricultural practices, education, etc. But there must be a master plan and at the landscape level that allows us to characterize the interventions that are needed and to connect the right sources of support and interventions. And this ideally should be linked to a jurisdiction to make sure that we are positively affecting governance processes and really getting into the transformational change that we need. Now, from where I stand, I feel I've been so lucky to work for more than 2 decades to try to find solutions to halt deforestation and forest degradation. And the road has been hard at times, but I'm an optimist and I believe that every contribution counts. And I can tell you that I feel more hopeful than ever before. I still remember back in 2009 when I used to work for the National Forest Commission of Mexico, where I'm originally from. And at the time, the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility was starting operations. The facility, or the FCPF, was receiving proposals to give $3.6 million grants to forest countries to get ready to reduce their emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And people like me were asked to do a peer review of the proposals that were submitted by our peers. I remember what I saw then was robust or very narrow proposals on how to strengthen sustainable forest management and improve surveillance and monitoring systems. But the vast majority, if not all of the proposals, really were not talking about the drivers of deforestation in our countries or proposing actions to tackle them. In some cases, we in the countries didn't even have the data. And in other cases, we didn't have the mandate or the political support to include activities beyond our sector. That was then, it was 10 years ago or a little bit more. And as a side note, $3.6 million grants to change our development paradigm. Nope, that's why our ministries of finance wouldn't even sit with us to brainstorm about solutions on how to land those funds. Anyway, let's go to the next slide, please. The point is that today we know so much more about the drivers of deforestation and degradation and about the potential responses we can set in motion. This figure comes from the Deforestation Fronts report I mentioned before and shows the latest information we have about the direct and indirect drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, and also maps out potential responses and approaches. We're seeing more and more solutions to address deforestation and its drivers being tailored to the local and regional context. And I think good progress has been made in lowering the rate of deforestation where integrated approaches have been implemented, particularly with engagement of local communities. But just to give an example, the soy moratorium in the Brazilian Amazon helped halt the expansion of soy. And some Brazilian soy suppliers very recently just announced that they will implement a 100% deforestation and conversion-free soybean value chain for the European salmon sector. And this is to ensure that the feed that's grown in the Brazilian Cerrado is not causing deforestation or conversion. So this is a collective effort that needed farmers, government, private sector, and civil society working together. Integrated multi-stakeholder solutions are needed, and I don't think one single approach is going to be enough to address the scale of the problem we are facing. We will need solutions that combine various approaches, such as protected and conserved areas, but supply chain initiatives and mitigation solutions, while making transformational changes in the way food is produced and consumed. This type of cross-sectoral and multi-level collaborations can allow us to scale up finance by aligning and tapping into different sources of funding appropriate for the different interventions on the ground. And to, in some cases, to repurpose or align different funding streams that might be in conflict. And we really need that, right? If we go to the next slide, we can see that there are currently billions of dollars of subsidies delivered to the farming and fishing sectors. However, you see in the graph, only just 1% goes towards actively benefiting the environment. A study we did found that between 2009 and 2012, Brazil and Indonesia allocated more than 100 times as much as money to industries driving deforestation like soy and beef than what they received in international aid from organizations like UN agencies or UN Red, etc., to protect their forests. Making it cheaper to produce commodities that drive deforestation artificially increases profitability and makes them more desirable for investors. So this is having terrible strides on deforestation and degradation. Perverse subsidies need to be rapidly redirected or phased out. And one promising avenue to explore is how to repurpose those as payments for ecosystem services for farmers who protect and restore forests and improve soil health and eventually impact positively human health of communities. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this figure and data from one of the New York Declaration on Forest Assessment reports, specifically on the progress of finance for forests, shows that support for the development and the implementation of strategies to reduce forest emissions remains insufficient. The magnitude of finance is highly disproportionate to the investments and the needs and the mitigation potential of the forest sector. Finance for forests in deforestation countries accounted for less than 3% of the global mitigation-related development funding back in 2017. Total finance to provide support for development and implementation of REDD+ strategies and to reward countries and jurisdictions amounted to roughly $20 billion since 2010, more or less. And this has been obviously inadequate and does not reflect the importance of forests to the climate solution. Furthermore, the amount is marginal and is dwarfed by the almost $800 billion spent on finance and subsidies for key commodities where deforestation occurs, as I just mentioned, but represented here in this slide by the gray bubbles on your screen. Okay, but going back to the good news. The State of Forest Carbon Finance report from last year shows that in the past 4 years, there has been a strong upward trajectory for forest carbon finance. At least $5.4 billion in REDD funding has been committed through development finance institutions, of which more or less, according to the study, 1.9 billion has already been allocated or dispersed to jurisdictions in developing countries. In addition, we should remember that the Green Climate Fund has allocated almost $500 million in REDD+ results-based payments to countries such as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Indonesia, etc. The FCPF Carbon Fund has signed more than $600 million in emissions reductions payments agreements, or ERPAs, as of, I think it was until April 2021. So we are seeing some progress and movement on the multilateral space. But The corporate sector is stepping in to support and invest in nature-based solutions that work for climate, but also for people and nature. And we're seeing this momentum very unprecedented. And I want to share an exciting partnership my team has been engaged with. Last October, HP officially announced an $80 million expansion of its forest conservation partnership with WWF to protect, restore, and improve the management of nearly 1 million acres of forest landscapes. And this is an area approximately 5 times the size of New York City. And this really moves from, this shows that HP is raising the bar for what leadership looks like for corporate climate and nature commitments, and signal businesses' demand for high integrity nature-based solutions. As HP and WWF, we are partnering up to direct these investments to deliver benefits for people, nature, and climate in key landscapes. And this is not a carbon transaction. As part of the company's 2030 sustainability and climate strategy, HP is pledging to address the downstream impacts of its business on nature by taking action on forests at the level that considers all the paper that runs through its printers and its print services by 2030. Excuse me. Now, HP paper and paper-based packaging are deforestation free and come from FSC certified and recycled sources. But consumers and business-to-business customers do not always use HP branded paper when using HP printers. So through this partnership, HP will now support nature-based solutions at a scale that seeks to balance the potential impact on forest of non-HP paper used in all its printers and print services. This is the kind of action we want more companies to embrace, instead of taking a transactional approach, really embarking into landscape partnerships. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then more recently, we also have Glasgow's developments. UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow was a different COP for multiple reasons. But for me, it was the first one where 2 messages came through loud and clear. The need to think strategically and comprehensively about how to address the climate and nature crisis together, and how this must put benefits for people at the center. When I was there, I was quite pleased to hear during the high-level segment of heads of state, political recognition of the role forests, nature, and land play, not only for tackling the climate crisis, but also for helping us to increase our resilience as humans, shielding us from a new pandemic. And as COP26 entered its third day, those statements became more tangible with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, through which more than 140 countries committed, I think 140 countries encompassing 90% of the world's forest, committed, or rather I would say recommitted to halt deforestation by 2030. Before COP21 in Paris, and even until the last hour of the negotiations there, we were struggling to make the case for why we needed forests to be recognized. This time around in Glasgow, forests were for front and center at the stage. This Glasgow declaration was accompanied by an economic package of around $19 billion, combining public funds, philanthropy, and private investments. From my perspective, a couple of key highlights are the committed funding of $1.7 billion to indigenous peoples and local communities to help protect their rights and clarify their land tenure. and also this pledge from 30 financial institutions to tackle commodity-driven deforestation. I get this question all the time, what is the difference from back in 2014? And I think the difference from when the New York Declaration on Forests was launched is the fact that the announcements were more truthfully presented as a collaborative pledge from developed and developing countries and public and private funds. The magnitude and complexity of nature loss, deforestation and unsustainable land use and their effects on climate are daunting. Yes, what I shared with you earlier, it's overwhelming. But with radical collaboration and alignment of efforts different from what we've seen before, we can turn the tide for forests. We are starting to see more and more north-south, public-private, supply-demand partnerships, and that's great, but we really need to switch towards implementation at full speed. And I, mindful of the time, just want to end by highlighting 3 key conditions that, from my perspective, need to be in place for the Glasgow pledges and the accompanying economic package to be effective. 1, more landscape partnerships. Interventions that need to be prioritized are those that should focus on delivering benefits for people, nature, and climate holistically, as opposed to only focusing on one value, for example, maximizing carbon outcomes. If we don't put people and nature equally at the center, these interventions would not last. An inclusive conservation and sustainable development approach is required to achieve emissions reductions from deforestation and degradation in the long run for the landscapes of the future. We must also, of course, fully recognize that in these landscapes, we should champion and recognize the critical role and long-standing leadership of indigenous peoples and local communities as stewards of forests. Numerous studies have documented the crucial role IPLCs, or indigenous peoples and local communities, play in conserving large forest areas within their territories, very often with high cost effectiveness. And I was extremely happy to see a breakthrough for this agenda in Glasgow. So in their commitments to forest-based solutions, governments must show greater, more direct support for these forest defenders and their rights, for the reasons I just mentioned, and because, quite simply, justice and sustainability cannot be separated. Donors and initiatives should engage these key stakeholders from the co-creation and design stages, as opposed to just inviting them to apply for funds that might not support what they need. Okay, point number 2. Implementation. We must allocate the majority of the resources upfront now to help accelerate the implementation of actions, policies, and measures to tackle deforestation, particularly in the least developed countries. The call for proposals that the LEAF coalition, a voluntary global coalition bringing together private sector and public sector and governments to scale up payment for results. It's an important and overdue signal of support for more advanced jurisdictional RED+ programs and their results they could deliver at scale. But at the same time, the challenges to get ready to go jurisdictions and the small amount of viable applications demonstrates the urgent need for financial assistance and partnerships to implement actions that really reduce emissions now, whether it's RED+ strategies, low carbon development plans. Now is the time to support jurisdictions to implement actions to deliver change and on the ground and to get more and more countries meeting ambitious goals to be eligible to receive payments for results. I don't think it's enough to dangle the carrot. You need to support the pathway to get to the carrot. And then number 3, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And we are living in a climate and nature emergency. We know that. So the economic package of public funds and private investments announced must consider the fastest and simplest way to disburse the financing. It would be unacceptable to create complex rules to obtain support. So donors and multilateral organizations must streamline their processes to facilitate and expedite access to funds. There are so many cases where financing takes more than 3-5 years even to materialize. That's just inadequate and frankly unethical, and changes must be made. Can we go to the final slide, please? So I just want to leave you with that final message, and just to reflect that as a community, we have a lot of work to do, and we will keep working. And we have to embrace the complexity and the messiness even of what it takes to save forests. We need diverse, multidisciplinary approaches, and we need to keep developing them. But we also need fresh thinking and big ideas from the next generation. And I can't wait to see what, as forest community, we will all contribute to achieve in the years to come. You all know that forests are central to our future, and we can't afford to lose sight of the forest for the trees. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Josefina. That was amazing. And it was great to hear so much about the space and all the work that you've been doing. We have around 15 minutes left for Q&A. And also, it was a perfect segue. I just wanted to plug tomorrow. We are having a panel on financing in forest restoration and protection. So it's just really great to be on that topic right now as well. I wanted to start off with a first question. You mentioned the increasing amount of corporate finance in the nature-based solution space. How can we ensure that this corporate finance meets the goals and priorities of local communities?
Sure, I can start with that, and that's a great question, and something that is at the center of my work these days, because as we've seen this unprecedented momentum for forest and nature-based solutions coming out from the corporate sector, what we are also seeing is that there's so many things going on that for corporates, it's hard to differentiate the good, the bad, and the ugly of what is being offered out there. So we, organizations like WWF, of course, we are trying to provide guidance to corporates to guide them on what are the principles and values that they need to be looking at. We just published in Glasgow a blueprint for interventions that work for climate, people, and nature. It's called Beyond Carbon Credits Interventions on Nature-Based Solutions that work for people, climate, and nature. And in that publication, we made the case of the need to, a little bit what I was saying before, you need to look at the context, and you need to engage local communities and put into place social and environmental safeguards. And there's other guidelines in that document that we can share if you are interested. But the point is, it's not one size fits all. You need to look at the context. You need to look at the stakeholders that are interacting in a landscape, and you need to ensure strong benefit sharing mechanisms and full and effective participation. When you talk about these things to corporates, they feel like working at the landscape level is very messy, and they get a little bit overwhelmed. So I think there's a responsibility of organizations in the civil society and as a community as a whole to make those connections and play a little bit translation role to help the right resources hit the right places in the best possible way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that insight. We now have one question from the Q&A chat. It is, how important is the role of protected areas as we try to avoid deforestation and the protection of our planet's climate? So I think focusing on the role of protected areas in this work.
Sure. I mean, I think protected areas continue to be an effective tool for conservation in many, many places. There's even more protected areas being launched or established as we speak. And in Glasgow, we saw some very important announcements on marine protected areas as well. So I think that definitely protected areas and other instruments that promote the conservation of other areas under conservation are key and are very important. Again, you need to look at the history and development of the landscapes to understand who lives there, who is affected by the protected area, and you need to compatibilize the rights of the people with the instrument that you are implementing to make sure that that you are promoting triple wins and not only imposing conservation on detriment of people and people's rights. So yeah. But there's many studies that show that protected areas are still a very, very effective tool for conservation. You just have to do it right.
Awesome. Thank you for that perspective. Next up, we have a question from Pilar Gomez Ruiz. She asks, how do you see the overview for Mexico to face the decade of restoration after negotiations at COP this past year?
Sorry, Emma, I lost you. Could you repeat?
Yes. We have a question from Pilar Gomez Ruiz. They ask, how do you see the overview for Mexico to face the decade of restoration after negotiations at COP?
I mean, Mexico is it's a country that has been affected by deforestation and degradation. I think degradation is a huge problem still, and therefore there's a huge potential for restoration. There is, I guess, in terms of ecological opportunities, there's plenty of ecological opportunities to advance restoration in Mexico. Again, I think what I was trying to make the point is to understand where restoration is really needed, but not in detriment of protection. So we should not use the future perspectives of restoring to stop protecting what we have still standing. And in Mexico, I think, I mean, there's Mexico has a history of very strong environmental policies, and one of the oldest programs of payment for ecosystem services that could also be a good model to replicate more locally, if not at the national level, but to adequate this to have payment for ecosystem services that support restoration in these degraded areas, which is really needed, and at the same time that you combine with protection tools. But after these negotiations, I mean, I think if anything, I really want to make sure that that we are not leaving this chat as with the gloom and doom sensation, but actually with a sense of hope and optimism, because I do think that we are seeing a very important momentum for forest, and we just need to harness that as an opportunity, whether it's in Mexico or in other countries.
Amazing, thank you. Now moving on to the next question. Bruce Kernan says, reliable and sufficient supplies of clean water are basic to human welfare. What are the possibilities for synergy between protecting and increasing stable supplies of water alongside protection of forests?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the type of thinking that I feel like our community needs to be pushing more and more for. We are very used to piecemeal approaches or project-based approaches where we are looking at oh, I just got this funding to do this action here and there. But we are in desperate need to lead with landscapes and lead with what is needed there. Understand what are the drivers of nature loss, climate change, and what is affecting people in the landscape. And fresh water, it's one of the key aspects where taking a landscape approach would have benefits or positive impacts. If you characterize the interventions that need to happen and connect them the right sources of finance, you will have co-benefits for multiple values. And because we were talking about Mexico, just to think about the program for ecosystem services there, the initial focus was on water services. and how to make sure that forest restoration and protection was giving directly water benefits for local people. And in fact, the main budget for that program at the beginning was the revenue for water taxes. So that was like the budget that we were using for protection of forests and for restoration. You have to be careful. Again, it's not like one size fits all. There's like places where planting trees will actually have a negative impact on water. So it's just need to look at the context and make sure that the interventions are informed by science and data.
Awesome. Yes, it all does seem very context-based, but important to look at it from that lens for sure. Next up, kind of back to the corporate financing realm, Thorog asks, will the corporate financing be able to step up rapidly enough to make a carbon sequestration difference in the temperature lowering of the planet? Can you define which species can be targeted for maximum rapid sequestration and growth?
That's a very interesting question. So there's two sides, one on species and one on corporate sector. One thing that I'm observing, and as I mentioned, one thing that really bothers me is how slow are some donors to move and to disperse the funds. And in the last couple of years, what I've seen is the corporate sector is way more nimble and agile and can allocate and disperse funds in a more rapid way than multilateral organizations. This is good, but there are risks. There are risks because if the corporate is ready to disperse millions of dollars so much faster, like in a period of months to start dispersing millions, the risk is that those millions places or into hands that are not what we need. So we that's why we're trying to advise them and create guidelines to channel that great energy into the best places and the best approaches. So definitely, I feel like if anything, the corporate sector is taking over in terms of like disbursement of finance, and has the capacity in some cases to even disperse even larger amounts of funds, depending on the corporation. So definitely, it's great, but has to do it with care, and we also need to be respectful of people on the ground, right, and the stakeholders. So we just need to be careful that corporates are working in accordance to the context needs and the people's rights, as opposed to just disperse to the wrong stakeholders, etc. So it's a huge opportunity, but we have to also do it right. In terms of the species, though, I do not want to say or mention any species, because my philosophy on forest restoration is that you have to put the right species in the right places. Definitely, the best strategy for restoration is to use native species. And to avoid introducing exotic species in places or for other species that do not belong to the ecosystem. So that would be my answer. Like, you don't, again, when you look at maximizing benefits, it should not be only the carbon angle that prevails. So therefore, for me, restoration should be done with native species to promote and protect the landscape and the ecological balance of the landscape where you work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We're nearing the end of our session. I think we have time for one more question and maybe some final reflections. I want to ask a question by your fellow Keynote, John Pereira. He asks, given that forest conversion and degradation are at least in part driven by global market and consumer demand, and by investments by millions of people who have no idea where their money sleeps at night, how much scope do you think there is for consumer education efforts and/or targeted boycotts?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a fundamental question and a fundamental variable of the equation to systems transformation. I touch on the talk a little bit on food systems, and I think we know very well that there's like around 4 commodities that causes so a huge percentage, like 90% of the deforestation is caused pretty much by the production of palm oil, soy, beef, and pulp and paper. And there's some examples, as the one I mentioned of the soy moratorium in the Cerrado, that can help, but certainly there's a lot of room for consumer education. And yes, when we need to support a boycott, just do it, because we have a responsibility as civil society and consumers to step up and to also be part of the change. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken disc, but the trick is in the context and what people needs, right? What would work for certain people in one part of the world might not work for others. While some people would like to move to a plant-based diet, that's something that other people cannot afford in other parts of the world. So I think consumer education is important, so that the consumer can make the choices and kind of like shift systems with their purchasing power. So for sure, there's a huge opportunity there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It appears we have almost reached the end of our allotted time with about 2 minutes left. I want to thank you, Josefina, for being here and sharing all of your great insight. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and participating in this discussion. It's been a really great session and a segue into all of our continued sessions right after this and tomorrow. Up next at the conference, we have the Innovation Prize presentations and Q&A. So definitely tune in for that. It's taking place at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time in just 1 minute. And the Zoom link for this call will be shared in the chat here. But just wanted to say thank you all so much. Thank you, Josefina, and hope to see you all at the rest of the session.